Hello, everyone. Welcome to an online lecture for 3040. So, we're going to take a little break somewhat from theory and focus on explication. Again, always want to give you a good kind of cross section of how literary scholars work. So, one important aspect of poetry is the sonnet. And again, in other areas, we would focus a lot more on kind of the influence. But I just kind of want to give you a general kind of focus. We haven't discussed poetry yet, so I wanted to do a little bit of an important definition, kind of general introduction to the sonnet sequences and so forth, and then just kind of play around with explication. So, the sonnet itself is a poetic form consisting of 14 lines originating from Italy in the 13th century and then made popular by Francisco Petrarca and then William Shakespeare. Now, there are many forms of sonnets, but two are the main forms. So, you'll hear Italian or what's called Petronic sonnet or English and then Shakespearean, right? So the Petrarchan and the Shakespearean sonnet are the most kind of popular ish, but there are numerous others, and even in modern poets, they still play around. There's a poet journal that's dedicated to just sonnets, and they kind of play around with conventions. Now, the sonnet and why it's often studied in literature, it was the primary form of poetry for the Renaissance, right? It could deal with a variety of subject matter in a relatively short space, which is, again, pretty much the appeal. So the Petrarchan sonnet, the structure of a typical Italian one, is that it included two parts that together formed a compact, or what we call an argument. So the first, the octave, which is two quatrains, so 8 lines divided into 4 lines, forms the proposition, which then describes a problem or question. The sestet, or two tercets, so 6 lines total, two divisions of 3 lines, follow the octave, usually proposes some sort of resolution, right? So typically the ninth line indicates what is called a turn, and this is crucial for sonnet writing. There always has to be some sort of turn, which is, in terms of the literary device, called volta. And this signals some sort of proposition to resolution. It could be a tonal shift. It could be an imagery shift. It has to just change the sonnet a little bit. Even in sonnets that don't strictly follow the problem resolution structure, that ninth line typically signals some sort of change. It could be in mood, it could be in stance, it could be in image, it could be in tone, or anything. The typical rhyme scheme, so this is where we haven't really kind of explicated literature to the extent we'll do with the sonnet form, begins with ABBA pattern for the octave, and then has a couple combinations CDE, or CDCCDC for the sestet. Over time, there's other variations too that you will see. So again, if you're interested in really picking apart the patterns of literature, this is why a lot of scholars gravitate to poetry, because there's a lot of specific devices in mind and specific structures in mind. So I'll give you an example of a Petrarchan sonnet, and this was written, past, Petrarchan's time. This is William Wordsworth, London, 1802. So we have the first octave, right? So those 8 lines divided into 4 lines, and notice the rhyme scheme and so forth. Right. So we have Milton, thou shouldst be living at this hour. England hath need of thee. She is a fen of stagnant waters, altar, sword, and pen. Fireside, the heroic wealth of hall and bower have forfeited their ancient English dower of inward happiness. We are selfish men, oh raise us up, return to us again, and give us manners, virtue, freedom, power. So then, when we're looking and breaking down sonnets, the good thing is that you could pretty much trace, again, those, especially if it's Petrarchan, and you could kind of notice it by the rhyme scheme and the structure, that okay, so let's talk about the theme or the problem, right? Well, here, what's he claiming? English writers lack creativity, right? Milton, the poet for Paradise Lost. We need you today, we need you living. England is stagnant. Altar, sword, pen, right? So religion, army, might, and then writing are all just stagnant, right? We forfeited the ancient English creativity, and now we're just selfish men. We're not doing anything worthwhile, right, with art. So here, then there's the turn, right, the octave. We have the volta. So, and notice too, in terms of grammar, we have our period here. So this is pretty much kind of like one full sentence. This kind of structure, notice how it says, she is a fen of stagnant waters. Now, one important aspect when you're reading poetry, if there's a line break that doesn't have punctuation marks, you read the whole thing as if it were not broken. So she is a fen of stagnant waters. You don't say she is a fen and then pause of stagnant waters. This is what we call enjambment. Enjambment is a very important concept because a lot of times the reason why people don't quite understand poetry is because they're just ending on the line without actually looking at the sentence structure of the poem. Here, oh yeah, sorry, I forgot this. So we actually have two sentences here. So notice again, everything is still actually in proper grammatical punctuation format. And so just pay attention when you see that open punctuation end line break. That's what we call enjambment. You read it as an entire line. So here, right, the only enjambment we have are the last two lines. So we basically say, thy soul was like a star and dwelt apart. Thou hadst a voice whose sound was like the sea, pure as the naked heavens, majestic free. So didst thou travel on life's common way in cheerful godliness, and yet thy heart the lowliest duties on herself did lay. So what do we have here? Well, here we kind of solve the problem, right? So what he's not directly kind of suggesting is that we should just follow him by his example. So Wordsworth wants us to, okay, Milton still exists. His voice still exists because of his writing and his poetry. So what do? We learn from him. And again, notice the different rhyme scheme at the end of each line. So sonnets are very compact, and that's one of the reasons why they're kind of hard to study at times because there could be a lot of ideas going at once. But it's also kind of important to kind of look at how we can structure literature in a very, very strict way. So the typical form of the English sonnet consists of, again, 14 lines. That's a typical line for sonnet. But it's structured a little differently. So we have three quatrains and then a couplet. So we have 3, 4 lines, and then the last two lines. The third quatrain generally introduces an unexpected sharp thematic or imagistic turn or volta. So again, no matter what sonnet form you're looking at, there always should be some volta somewhere. Here it's usually in the last two lines with Shakespeare. Other English sonnets kind of have it at the third quatrain. Again, sometimes, and Shakespeare does both. So just a little hint though, with the few ones that we're reading, most of the time the volta is coming in that last two lines. And it usually summarizes the theme of the poem or introduces a fresh new look. Authors, of course, will use both ways of making this turn, so you have to kind of determine where it may be. Now, we'll get into meter in a second, but it is an iambic pentameter. And if you're, again, very interested in the structure of poetry, iambic pentameter pretty much mimics how English language is intonated, how we generally speak in terms of emphasis, de-stressed, and stressed syllables. The typical rhyme scheme with the end rhyme is A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, and G, G. So, in terms of an example, again, I'm going to give you a different one other than Shakespeare here. This is John Keats, Romantic poet. So, again, hundreds of years later than Shakespeare. And this is when I have fears that I may cease to be. So, let's look at the kind of full sonnet and then determine the volta. When I have fears that I may cease to be before my pen has gleamed my teeming brain, before high piled books in charity hold like rich garners the full ripened grain, when I behold upon the night starred face huge cloudy symbols of a high romance, and think that I may never live to trace their shadows with the magic hand of chance, and when I feel, fair creature of an hour, that I shall never look upon thee more, never have relish in the fairy power of unreflecting love, then on the shore of the wild world I stand alone, and think till love and fame do nothingness to sink. So, as we see here, we have enjambment. So again, notice how we want to stop at the line breaks here where there's clear punctuation, but we want to keep reading. Fears that I may cease to be before my pen is gleamed. We don't want to stop. Here, same thing, never live to trace their shadows. We don't want to stop. We don't want to say, and think that I may never live to trace, and then their shadows with that would create an awkward kind of rhythm as well as probably a misunderstanding of how these lines work. So, and think that I may never live to trace their shadows. So again, enjambment is crucial to make sure that you are reading poetry properly. Now, in this case, we see the kind of first two quatrains, right? They have a single idea, but a common problem, right? A common theme, right? So, fear of losing the ability to write and fear of losing the ability to capture nature, right? I fear that I may be unable before my pen is gleamed, right? Before I could write, that my mind is going, or that I die before I could write everything I want to down. And then here we see a little bit of that chain, right? That I never shall look upon thee more, never have relish in the very power of unreflecting love, right? So the last quatrain and the couplet kind of discuss that turn, right? He will be alone, right? And think of nature and love, right? So, to love and fame do nothing to sink, right? So, you know what? He could still think about nature. He could still appreciate nature even when he can't write about it. So, again, very interesting kind of ideas, very compact. Now, in terms of poetic devices, iambic pentameter, as I said, is the most common meter typically in English poetry because it reflects the speaking habits of English speakers. Now, when we get to breaking things down, so meter is a unit of rhythm in poetry, the pattern of the beats. Rhythm is measured in small groups of syllables called feet. So an iamb refers to the type of foot used. Here, the iamb, which in English indicates unstressed syllable followed by stressed. And then pentameter means basically 5 feet, right? So 10 words total, right? So we have here, right? So when we mark it, and here's typically how we divide the syllables up in a line. So we have from fair, escrit, chers, we, desire, increase. So what we're doing is we're marking the unstressed, stressed. From fairest creatures, we desire increase, right? So when we look at it from fair as creatures, because we say creatures, not creatures, right? We desire, it's not desire, it's desire. Same thing with increase. It's not increase, it's increase. So this is where poetry can get really complicated if you want to study it, because you have to understand how intonation works. So I did all the kind of scansion, what we call scansion, on this poem to really help just look at how things not always are following the strict formula, but in general, most of the time they are. This is a good example of sometimes the lines actually start with the stressed because even though you want to follow mostly the pattern, sometimes you just have to, and especially if you ever written a song, you just kind of have to fudge pronunciation or figure, the word is going to be good, but the rhythm can be affected. So you just, follow a change in rhythm rather than sacrificing, meaning for just focusing on the syllables. But for the most part, we read again from fairest creatures, we desire increase, that there by beauty's rose might never die, right? So notice how again that kind of ending, right? Again, play around. It's probably going to be a little bit unnatural too because you have to think about how we pronounce words, right? Like tender. So it's not tender, right? Tender. It's not memory, right? It's memory. So you want to look at what's stressed and unstressed in a word, right? Typically, pronouns and things like that will be unstressed, right? Like thy foe, right? But sometimes, depending for emphasis, it won't be. So you just have to kind of be careful, right? But again, usually articles and prepositions, are going, and conjunctions are usually unstressed. Nouns are going to be stressed. So you just want to play around with how you could think about how things should sound, right? But this is a good example. It's not making, right? We don't say making, we say making. So the stressed is on the A, right? The unstressed is on the I. And again, sometimes you're going to sound weird talking aloud, but that's pretty much the best way to kind of think about scansion. Now, the sonnet, again, pretty much was the dominating form for Western poetry for 600 years. It becomes old fashioned, and if you want to blame anybody specific, it's pretty much the transcendentalists in America, the, Walt Whitman, definitely who, focused on more free verse style of poetry. That's when it really kind of starts getting out of favor. But as I said, it's still a highly written form. It's just not as kind of mainstream as it once was. The rise of free verse, especially all structured forms became generally antiquated, right? And that's pretty much the destruction of the sonnet is once we had free verse, once we had total abandonment of conventions in modernism, the sonnets kind of got boring. And again, there are still modern sonnets, but it's just not the guiding force of poetry anymore, right? Um, Freestyle would definitely be a more guiding form. So when we look at the context of Shakespeare's sonnet sequence that we've been talking about in terms of all the theories and so forth. So Shakespeare's sonnet sequence is comprised of 154 sonnets that were published in 1609. The vast majority of these sonnets are addressed to an unnamed attractive young man who represents beauty, love, and praise. In these sonnets, Shakespeare is reiterating to the young man that it is his duty to marry and have kids, urging him to reproduce so that his physical beauty will be eternalized through future generations. So you see a lot of kind of queer theory, and feminist theory kind of overlapping here in terms of why people still read Shakespeare's sonnets, because we have a very homosocial element, we have a homoerotic element, and then we have, again, the perpetuation of, heteronormativity and so forth. So it's a really interesting kind of dynamic when we look at his sonnet sequence in conjunction with the theories that we've discussed. Now, in addition, some of the later sonnets in the series are written about a dark lady and focus on kind of degrading sexual desires. Shakespeare's sonnets kind of help to increase his prominence as a poet with, of course, a unique style. And, of course, that's why partly, Shakespeare is still studied today because he reinvented the form for English readers. Now, especially if you're interested in queer theory, there's so much going on with Shakespearean queer theory. Aviva Dausch, Michael Kiev, Rao Wianato, Madhavo Menon, and numerous other critics have posited that Shakespeare was bisexual or gay based on letters and so forth and other documents, and the sonnets kind of exhibit his sexual preference for men. Given the selection we will read or have read, think about how the sonnets reveal any of these tendencies, especially in light of homosocial bonds, not necessarily homoeroticism, but we could, and there's enough scholarly work that kind of says otherwise. Other aspects too that queer theorists analyze, like again heteronormativity and so forth. So think about to what extent do you agree or disagree with this interpretation or these interpretations. And then, while certain queer theorists, of course, argue that trying to determine Shakespeare's sexuality goes against the point of queer theory, others argue that if Shakespeare were gay or bisexual and we could actually have that documentation, it would have a normalizing effect on other sexualities. So, again, that's another kind of important debate within queer theory, especially is like, do you have to play what is often referred to as gay detective, right? Do you really need to know the sexuality of the author? Some people say no, that's kind of, again, Foucault and Barth, it's kind of reading too much into the author's life, while others say no, if the greatest writer in England, right, and then now in the kind of English speaking world was either bisexual or homosexual, that would matter. So it's a very interesting kind of dynamic when we get to what queer theorists kind of discuss, focus on, and of course debate. Obviously, if you need this in alternative format, please email or contact the Disability Support Services. Obviously, if you have any questions, post them in Canvas. If not, good luck with all the assignments this week and take care.